I'm going to take a moment, Councilman, and bring you back to that December 2016 meeting. I had been back in City Hall for about 2 months. I was the lonely administration official sitting in the crowd when you asked for someone to come to the podium and say, what is the city going to do next? And when I stood there, I made you a promise that, one, a new brilliant lawyer was starting in the law department, and that she and I were going to get this done. So 2 years later, I think what you have before you today is an ordinance designed to protect New Orleans and its cultural integrity, but also bring us into the 21st century in a way that will really lead this nation. So this ordinance is designed to allow for 5G deployment in the city of New Orleans. It establishes franchise fees, which are recurring fees on an annual basis, as well as permit fees for the installation of antennas and poles throughout the city. There are restrictions in place and exceptions around residential areas. As you noted, Council Member, there are at least 9 departments who review each application to ensure that the aesthetics match what is in the right-of-way. I want to take a moment and thank all of those 9 departments. I won't list them all, but our Chief Technology Officer is in the crowd, John Wisby. He has been very instrumental in helping us get this across the finish line, along with Kim LeGroux, the Chief Information Officer, and Tracy Tyler in the Law Department. So that's what I have. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Spears, Ms. Wisby, as always. Thank you for working on the other branch of government so we could make this happen. We also have with us today Professor Christopher Davis from the University of Maryland. And I'd ask if you could come up briefly. You know, as with all things and with all technology, we want to make sure that anything we do, at first, like it's almost like the doctor's oath, do no harm. We want to make sure that, you know, this emerging technology would absolutely do no harm to any citizens. Now, I know that you have testified before the FCC, and there are there are a number of federal government statistics which show that the number of brain tumors have decreased since mobile phones were widely introduced in the 1980s. We have public comment card. And the data is very clear, and I'd ask that you could speak on it from your perspective and your education.
Council members, Mr. Chair, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Let me give you a very brief background. I'm Christopher Davis. I'm the Minter Martin Professor of Engineering at the University of Maryland, as well as Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering. And I've been involved with research onto the effects of radio frequency fields on animals and humans since 1977. I've worked a lot with the FDA and other government agencies, and so I feel as if I've got a very broad background in explaining how safe low-level radio frequency emissions are, and that includes 5G. There are various international standard settings bodies that have looked at all the literature, and they've set up standards for the safe levels of exposure of humans to radio frequency, and they've covered all frequencies up to 300 gigahertz. That's way, way higher than is contemplated for 5G. And the levels of exposure that you would get from small cells are tiny fractions of the maximum safe exposures. Just to tell you how a safe exposure was arrived at, the military got this started because they were concerned about the exposure of military personnel to high-power radar systems. And so they wanted to make sure that there were certain levels that were totally safe for their personnel, and the Navy was very active in doing this. And what they did was they exposed various kinds of animals to high levels of radio frequency, and they looked, when did the animals show some effect? And I'm not suggesting that the animals developed tumors or died. what they saw were changes in behavior. In other words, the animals were clearly beginning to be sensitive to the heating effects of the radiation at a certain level, and this made them change their behavior. So from the levels of exposure that cause these not necessarily harmful effects in animals, but effects, they set the standard for public exposure a safety factor of 50 below that. So the levels of exposure that are permitted, and I'm talking now about the maximum levels of exposure, are very tiny compared to what's ever been observed to cause an effect in an animal or a human. And in my experience, there's no conclusive evidence at all that low-level radio frequencies cause harmful effects in animals or humans. Even though there are some reports that you will find on the internet and in the literature claim that they see effects, some of the effects seen are in fact are not adverse effects. They, in many cases, are just response to the small amount of heating that can occur if you get a higher level exposure to radio frequency radiation. And so 5G installations at the present time are not much different from the cell phone installations we've had for quite a while, but we are moving to higher frequencies. The higher frequencies are actually safer, if you want to even think about there being a safety issue, because high frequency radio frequency waves can't penetrate much below the top of the skin. And so your own body protects you against any effect other than heating. And the low powers involved in these 5G installations, I think, makes them incredibly safe, and they have been studied for years. The technology is well understood, and although there are people out there who get concerned about health effects from radio frequencies, there's no evidence that these are real effects caused by the radio frequencies. Some people claim to experience symptoms when they think they are near radio frequency exposure. But all the studies that have been done are what are called provocation studies, where they expose people to radio frequencies or they don't expose them. They found that most people, first of all, don't know when they're being exposed. And in many of these studies, most of the recipients of these radiations from radio frequency sources actually claim that they are being exposed when in fact the radio frequency sources are turned off. And in fact, the medical community has come up with a term to describe this phenomenon. People do develop real symptoms, but they're not caused by the radio frequency. And the medical term for this is idiopathic environmental intolerance. In other words, if people believe something is dangerous, they can develop symptoms even when the cause is not the actual cause that causes the effect. And I'm happy to take questions.
I just have a few. I've studied your work and studied this area, and I've looked at a number of organizations that are considered to be of some import that say that wireless devices pose no health risk, and those organizations include, I would say that they agree with your synopsis of this area: the World Health Organization, the American Cancer Society, the National Institutes of Health, National Cancer Institute, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, and the Food and Drug Administration. Would you agree that those organizations have also would agree with your synopsis today?
Yes, and there are many more. There's the National Council on Radiation Protection and Measurement, the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, the International Conference on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, and the health organizations of many countries that keep an eye on this whole issue and check if they ever need to change the standards. And there's been no consensus that the standards need to be made lower than they currently are, because they're believed to be so low as to be completely safe at this present time.
And if we're talking about, for the listening public, if we're talking about what sort of devices we're talking about, we'd be referring to things like baby monitors or routers or garage door openers. Those things use radio frequencies as well, correct?
That's right. In fact, the largest exposure that the average person may get is from an older microwave oven, which is allowed to leak under FCC rules, or I should say FDA rules. It can leak at a significant level that's hundreds of thousands of times higher than what you might get from cellular communication systems. And as you rightly said at the beginning of your comments, there is no evidence that use of a cell phone causes brain tumors. In fact, regrettably, we're reaching a point now where everybody on the planet is a cell phone user. And so whatever illness they suffer from, somebody could say, well, it must be caused by the cell phone. But in fact, that's not true.
Thank you, Doctor. Any questions from the dais? Seeing no questions, I appreciate you coming and being with us today, and we will shift to public comment.
Thank you very much.
Mr. President, I have questions for the providers.
Okay.
If I believe there's some representatives from Verizon and AT&T, they could come up.
Could you all come up to the table, please? Professor, thank you.
Oh, sure. If Mobility wants to come up too, that's fine. I think we have just enough chairs.
Yep.
If you all could introduce yourselves, that'd be appreciated.
Keith, here you go.
Amanda Alvarez, AT&T, small cell deployment.
Michelle Robinson, Verizon. April Brumfield, Verizon.
Danielle Agee, Verizon.
David Arbery, AT&T.
Michael Ruffin, AT&T.
And Jonathan Levine with Mobility.
Thank you. So just a few questions, and I know I've talked to many of you all in the past, but I think it's important for the public to have an understanding of this. So as we move toward building out this infrastructure, which I think is important, obviously, and I support 5G, and I think that is certainly the future, and we need to move in that direction as quickly as possible. But you know, whoever wants to start, that's fine. But tell me about how this is going to impact your customers. Tell me about what this means for their bills. Tell me about what this means for them, for their everyday life. What does this mean for the everyday person here in the city of New Orleans?
Well,
Take it,
Councilmember,
Michelle.
Thank you for the question. Just so the council members know a little bit about me, I am Michelle Robinson, and I'm responsible for Verizon's public policy work at a state and local level for a generous swath of the geography of the nation. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm happy to answer any and all questions that you might have. So Councilmember Moreno, your question is really around, as I interpret it, will customers be paying in the form of increased bills, prices on their bills, for deployment as it, you know, the deployment that we are envisioning and sort of paving that path to the future of
Yes.
5G? The answer is no, Councilmember Moreno, and the reason for that is as follows. This industry, in particular, Verizon, and I would put AT&T in this category as well, that they don't let me put words in your mouth, AT&T representatives, are among the highest investors in the nation when it comes to capital. That's that infrastructure, the equipment, the things that go underground and attached to poles. When we deploy networks, we invest more capital in doing that than any other company, any other industry in the nation. And our capital investment over the past many, many years has been very flat over time. All right, with that in mind, also understand that from a CPI perspective, a consumer pricing index perspective, you would understand that nationally, for a gallon of milk, for a loaf of bread, generally speaking, prices tend to increase over time. That's not true in the wireless sector. Prices for wireless services are tending to decrease over time. Now, it's a small decrease, but it is a decrease over time, despite the fact that this investment in this capital is pretty flat over time. Now, so you might wonder, well, if you're not charging higher prices and you're continuing to invest, how do you run a business? That's where running a smart business comes into play. So this is a very competitive industry. unlike maybe the gas industry or the energy industry, where there's a guaranteed rate of return, there's this commitment with the government, there's ratepayers, none of that exists here. This is highly and irreversibly competitive industry. And what that means is we have to run incredibly cost-efficient businesses. We have to be smart about what we're bringing to market for consumers to make sure that it's cost-effective and that consumers actually want it. We have to have a value proposition in place for consumers to want to buy our products and services. We spend our time, outside from times like this where we're working on policy together, fighting with each other, taking one another's customers. So we have to be very cost-effective and have that value proposition for consumers to want to stay with us so we can continue in this business. So the answer to your question, Councilmember Moreno, is frankly just no.
David, would you agree?
Yeah, she makes a very good point, and I will say, just as we've spoken on before, it is a very competitive environment. We have begun deploying this similar infrastructure, which for the small cells all across the state. And in my role as State Director for Corporate, External, and Legislative Affairs, we've seen some tremendous impact to the consumers and our customers by creating a better customer experience, improving speeds. In many communities, about 6 municipalities across Louisiana, some who did not have a franchise requirement like Port Allen, but others, like the city of Baton Rouge, where we already have existing small cells on our network. They're continuing to enhance our existing 4G LTE network. These will improve the existing customers' already wireless experience, and there has not been any price increase that has impacted those customers thus far. Because of the competitive nature of our business, just as she articulated, prices overall have tended to trend down. We don't have any current plans that we're able to talk or roll out, and even that we see right now that really talks about the 5G. Our enhancement of the 4G LTE network is needed in the city of New Orleans. It has increased hundreds of percent over the last 3 years. In particular, the demands are so great on our network that we need additional capacity. So our primary need, in addition to building our network for 5G, is really to enhance our LTE network, and it is much needed, and it's going to create a very good customer experience.
And David, I think you bring up a really good point. We're not going to have 5G phones for quite some time. Many of us won't be able to afford them, but both Verizon and AT&T are currently expanding the network and growing the network so much that we'll be able to use our current phones much more effectively. I think, David, you and I were talking about when trying to download a video or trying to send a picture to someone and it's just frozen there.
On the Saints game.
Oh, exactly. Or even during a Mardi Gras parade, I mean, the same happens then. That connectivity will be increased as well. Am I correct?
Yes.
That's correct. And Councilmember Moreno, if I can just add from a public safety perspective, right? I happened to be in Panama City at the time that Hurricane Michael blew through there and really did damage to networks in that area. And you want to have a network that is reliable and sustainable and works for your public safety sector, your law enforcement folks, in all circumstances. So I think that's an important consideration here, to the point the gentleman from AT&T made. If there's a strain on capacity now, we must get ahead of that.
And I just want to ask one question, and it's really the equity factor. We know that 5G is coming. How quickly can we make sure that 5G is for all people in New Orleans and not just for those who have a lot of money and can afford one of the 5G phones? I think right now they're like $1,700 or $2,000. What do we do to make sure that 5G isn't just for those coming in for the big conventions? What do we do to make sure 5G isn't just for the big corporations that are in this city? What do we do to make sure that 5G is for the everyday hardworking person to be able to utilize?
So I think it's a very important question, and I want all of you to know on Verizon's behalf that our company certainly operates with a great deal of respect for community. In fact, I'll just mention that last year when there was this big debate, a successful debate I would add, around criminal justice reform, Verizon's general counsel, on behalf of Verizon, in support of all of our employees, voiced an opinion there, and a strong one, in support of criminal justice reform. So that just speaks to, you know, Verizon's culture and our embracing of communities, in particular in this case, you know, civil rights. I would say, Councilmember Moreno, if we're to use history as a good predictor of the future, 4G networks today are deployed, you know, to 98% of America's population. I would say our network is throughout the city of New Orleans. We had to start somewhere to get there, right? And so over time, we will see similar things happening with 5G. There are also safety net programs that the federal government has in place. All of us who are mobile phone users in this room pay a little fee on our mobile phone bill every month called the Universal Service Fee, which goes to a federal program that, you know, is designed to make sure that those who are most income challenges, communities that are most income challenged, have a little bit of a safety net. It's sort of, there's a schools and libraries program that allows for the deployment of broadband infrastructure, wireline and or wireless, in underrepresented communities, particularly as well as rural areas and low income, and like I said, in schools and libraries across the country. So broadband from a mobility and a landline perspective exists today in those communities, and there's a safety net as well. So I guess my answer to your question, Councilmember Moreno, is that's why we're here today, because we want to get started, quite frankly, and we must start somewhere. So all of your support for this ordinance gets us on that critical first step path toward getting what the state that you envision.
David?
Now you see why I like to follow behind
Yeah.
her. She articulates them very well. But yes, we do participate in the federal programs and support those. In addition to those existing programs, E-rate and things like that, we also each have local programs that we are certainly expanding in this market. AT&T, one of the things you'll hear about this year is we're expanding in a tremendous way our distribution locations for our retail opportunities for customers, and we will also be expanding the promotion of our low-income program for broadband called Access for $10, I think up to 10 megs, but it's just a start to meet people where they are. Those who are on supplemental assistance called SNAP are certainly eligible for that. In addition to that, we're making huge investments across the city in many of the underserved areas, expanding high-speed internet and fiber. It's called AT&T Fiber. We appreciate your patience. A number of stakeholders and customers and citizens have called because of complaints and digging and things of that nature, but it's millions of dollars of investment we're making so that we don't leave anyone out.
Yeah. Well, as we know, a tech divide means an opportunity divide. So just know I'm going to keep pushing both of you all on that equity piece. I think it's really important, and whoever comes after me, I'm going to have them push on you all as well.
Absolutely.
So thank you all for answering my questions. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Madam Vice President, and I'm glad, Ms. Robinson, that you brought up bad weather events or emergency situations. Our city is no stranger to those.
I understand.
We typically get them several times a year. And so it's not just sending a funny picture to somebody during a festival. Sometimes it's trying to find where your loved one is when the lights go out or when bad weather is imminent. And that type of connectivity does become a public safety issue. So I'm glad you brought that point out. And to your point, Council Vice President, I do hope that all of these service providers look at this evolution with the same equity lens that this committee is. We live in a very poor town, but we will be doing our part. We're right now investing in this infrastructure, and we are in this better process, franchise process.